Mark Donovan seemed to have the perfect life-successful career, a loving wife, Emma, and a close-knit group of friends. But behind closed doors, Mark was hiding a dark secret. For months, he had been having an affair with Emma's best friend, Laura King. What started as a secret romance turned into a web of lies, and as the affair deepened, Mark realized that Laura was becoming a threat to everything he had worked so hard to build. Desperate to keep his secret hidden, Mark made a choice that would change their lives forever. On a quiet evening, what should have been a normal day turned into a nightmare. Laura was found dead, and the once perfect world Mark had constructed began to crumble. As investigators began piecing together the truth, shocking revelations about the affair, betrayal, and a deadly cover-up would come to light. Mark's perfect life was nothing but an illusion, and the truth was about to destroy everything. This story is not just about love and betrayal, it's about how far someone will go to protect their darkest secrets, even if it means committing the ultimate crime. Now, we'll delve into the twisted events that led to Laura King's tragic death and uncover the shocking truth behind this murderous affair. Mark Donovan had always been the kind of man people admired, charming, successful, and with a seemingly perfect marriage to his wife, Emma. Together, they built a life that appeared solid from the outside. Emma, a caring and hard-working woman, trusted Mark completely. They had been together for nearly a decade, and over the years, Mark had worked hard to provide a comfortable, even luxurious lifestyle for them. They lived in a suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Emma was the type of wife who organized dinners with neighbors, charity events, and weekend getaways for them and their close-knit group of friends. One of those friends was Laura King, Emma's best friend since high school. Laura had always been a part of their lives, and over the years the three of them grew closer. Laura was single and vibrant, known for her wit and charm. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention in any room, a stark contrast to Emma's softer, more nurturing demeanor. Laura had a way of making people laugh, including Mark, who often found himself mesmerized by her energy. At first, it was innocent. Laura would join them for dinners, and they'd laugh over a glass of wine. But as time passed, Mark found himself drawn to Laura more than he should have been. It started with lingering glances, subtle compliments, and shared jokes that felt like they were just between the two of them. While Emma was often busy with work or her community events, Mark and Laura found themselves alone more frequently. And every time they were alone, the flirtation between them grew. One night, after a particularly long dinner party, Laura stayed back to help clean up. Emma had gone to bed early, exhausted from the evening, and Mark and Laura found themselves alone in the kitchen, washing dishes and talking. The conversation started innocuously enough, discussing the evening and laughing about their mutual friends. But as the night wore on and the wine flowed, the tone shifted. There was a moment, brief but electrifying, when their hands touched, and neither of them pulled away. What started as harmless teasing turned into late-night text messages. At first, they told themselves it was just fun, nothing serious. But the texts became more frequent, more intimate. Before long, they were meeting in secret. The affair was intoxicating for both of them, driven by the thrill of sneaking around and the danger of getting caught. Mark, who had always seen himself as a devoted husband, now found himself swept up in a passion he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was just a phase, that it would pass, but deep down he knew he was already in too deep. For Laura, the affair was something she had never expected, but once it began, she was all in. She had always admired Mark from a distance, the successful businessman, the loving husband, but now that she had him, she didn't want to let go. She began to crave their time together, the secret moments that were just for them. It wasn't just about the physical connection, although that was undeniable. It was about the emotional intimacy they shared. They could talk for hours, and in those conversations, Laura began to feel like Mark was the one person who truly understood her. As the affair continued, the lies multiplied. Mark found himself making excuses to Emma, working late more often, taking business trips, all to spend time with Laura. Emma, trusting and unaware, never suspected a thing. She believed that Laura was a loyal friend, someone who would never betray her, and Mark played the role of the devoted husband, all while hiding his darkest secret. But affairs like this couldn't last forever. Eventually, Laura began to feel the weight of the lies. She had feelings for Mark, and she wanted more from him than just stolen moments. Mark, however, wasn't ready to leave his wife. He loved the life he had built with Emma, even if his actions said otherwise. The affair, once thrilling and dangerous, started to become a burden. Laura wanted Mark to make a decision, but he knew that any choice he made would have devastating consequences. The tension between them grew, and what had once been fun now felt like a ticking time bomb. Every meeting was fraught with the risk of being caught. Mark became increasingly paranoid, checking his phone constantly, always looking over his shoulder. He knew that if Emma ever found out, it would destroy everything. But the more he tried to distance himself from Laura, the more she pushed for answers. She wanted to know where they stood, what their future would look like. For Laura, the affair had become more than just an escape. She had fallen in love with Mark, and she couldn't imagine going back to the way things were before. She began to pressure him to leave Emma, to commit to her fully. But Mark, who had always been able to charm his way out of difficult situations, found himself cornered. He couldn't leave Emma, but he also couldn't let go of Laura. As the affair dragged on, the tension between Mark and Laura grew unbearable. Laura gave him an ultimatum: either he left Emma or she would tell her the truth. Mark, fearing the fallout of such a revelation, knew that he had to act fast. The affair that had once been his escape had now become his greatest nightmare. In his desperation, Mark began considering a terrible solution. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his marriage or his reputation. And, with Laura threatening to expose everything, he saw only one way out. The idea of getting rid of Laura permanently had been creeping into his mind for weeks, but now it was becoming clearer. If Laura were out of the picture, all his problems would disappear. The thought was terrifying, but for Mark it felt like the only way to protect the life he had built. Mark's life was spiraling out of control, and the once carefully balanced world he had created was starting to collapse. The affair with Laura had become a noose tightening around his neck, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. Laura's demands for a future together grew more insistent, and the pressure was suffocating. She no longer wanted to be the other woman, hiding in the shadows while Mark played the role of the perfect husband. She wanted more, and she wanted it now. The strain of living two lives began to weigh heavily on Mark. He was constantly on edge, paranoid that someone would find out. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, fearing it was a message from Laura that Emma might see. He started avoiding his usual haunts, terrified that he and Laura would be seen together. The lies were piling up, and the guilt was becoming unbearable. At home, Emma had started to notice the changes in her husband. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began, but something was different. Mark was more distant, more distracted, and their once easygoing relationship had become strained. He spent more time at work, claimed to be overwhelmed by projects, and seemed to be avoiding any meaningful conversation. Emma, always the optimist, initially chalked it up to stress. After all, Mark had been working harder than ever, and she knew the pressures of his job could be immense. But as the weeks passed, Emma's suspicions grew. She noticed the way Mark would quickly hide his phone when she walked into the room, the way he seemed agitated when she asked him about his day. She started asking more questions, probing into his whereabouts, but Mark was always ready with an excuse. He would tell her that he had late meetings or that he was preparing for a big presentation, but Emma wasn't convinced. The distance between them grew, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Meanwhile, Laura's patience was running thin. She had given Mark months to make a decision, but he continued to stall. The thrill of the affair had long since worn off for her, and now all she wanted was a future with Mark, one where they didn't have to sneak around and lie. She was tired of being the secret, tired of watching Mark go home to Emma every night while she was left alone. She began pressuring him more aggressively, giving him ultimatums and demanding answers. Mark, feeling trapped, tried to placate Laura with promises that he never intended to keep. He told her that he just needed more time, that things with Emma were complicated, but Laura wasn't buying it anymore. She had been patient, but her patience had run out. One night, during a heated argument, Laura gave Mark a final ultimatum: either he left Emma or she would tell her everything. The ultimatum sent Mark into a panic. He couldn't afford to let Laura blow up his life. His mind raced as he considered his options, but none of them seemed viable. If Emma found out about the affair, it would ruin everything. His marriage, his reputation, and the life he had worked so hard to build would all come crashing down. The thought of losing Emma terrified him, not because he loved her, but because of what it would mean for his carefully constructed world. Desperation began to take hold of Mark. He couldn't let Laura destroy everything, but he also couldn't walk away from the affair cleanly. Laura knew too much, and if she felt betrayed, she would have no hesitation in exposing him. The walls were closing in, and Mark felt like there was no way out. That's when the dark thought entered his mind, the thought that had been lurking in the back of his consciousness for weeks. What if Laura were out of the picture? If she were gone, all of his problems would disappear. The affair would die with her, and Mark could go back to his life with Emma as if nothing had ever happened. It was a horrifying thought, one that sent a shiver down his spine, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only solution. Mark became consumed with the idea. He started planning, thinking of ways to make it look like an accident. He couldn't afford to get caught, so it had to be clean, foolproof. Every interaction with Laura was now tinged with tension as Mark calculated his next move. He knew that time was running out, and if he didn't act soon, Laura would expose the affair, and his life would be ruined. As the days passed, Mark's paranoia grew. He became more distant from Emma, more erratic in his behavior, and more secretive than ever before. He was constantly on edge, his mind racing with dark thoughts. The guilt and fear were eating away at him, but he felt like he had no other choice. The affair had become a ticking time bomb, and the only way to defuse it was to eliminate Laura. In the final days leading up to the murder, Mark's interactions with Laura became increasingly strained. She sensed that something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She continued to pressure him, but Mark was distant, cold, and calculating. He had already made up his mind, and now all he had to do was wait for the right moment. The pressure was mounting, and Mark knew that the time to act was drawing near. The affair had started as a secret escape, a thrilling adventure, but now it had turned into a nightmare. And for Mark, there was only one way to wake up from it. Mark Donovan's mind was racing as he drove toward the secluded spot outside of town. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dim glow of the dashboard. It was a place he and Laura had visited before, a hidden spot away from prying eyes, where they had once stolen passionate moments away from the constraints of their lives. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Mark had no intention of rekindling those feelings. Instead, his mind was consumed by the desperate, horrifying solution he had come to believe was the only way out of the nightmare that his life had become. As Mark drove, his thoughts churned. How had it come to this? Only months ago, he had been a man with everything: a successful career, a beautiful wife who adored him, and the respect of his friends and colleagues. He had been content, or at least he thought he had been. But Laura had changed everything. She had reignited a spark in him, a feeling of excitement and freedom that he hadn't realized he had been missing. At first, it had felt like a game, something thrilling and harmless. But it hadn't stayed harmless for long. Now, as Mark navigated the winding road toward the woods where he and Laura would meet, he realized the full weight of what he had done. The affair had spiraled out of control, and Laura had become a threat, one that could destroy the life he had built with Emma. And now, in his desperation, Mark had made a decision he couldn't take back. Laura had texted him earlier that evening, asking him to meet her. She had been growing more and more frustrated with his indecision, and her messages had become increasingly insistent. She wanted answers, she wanted a future with him, not just stolen moments in the dark. But Mark had nothing to give her. He couldn't leave Emma, no matter what Laura wanted. He had built a life with his wife that was worth preserving, even if it meant betraying Laura in the process. As Mark pulled into the clearing, he saw Laura's car already parked beneath the cover of trees. She was standing outside, arms crossed against the cool night air, her silhouette illuminated by the car's headlights. Mark turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, staring at her from a distance. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This was at the moment of no return. He could still turn back, still find a way to end things without violence. But deep down, he knew it was too late for that. The decision had already been made. Mark got out of the car and walked toward Laura, his footsteps slow and deliberate. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of anger and expectation. "We need to talk," Laura said, her voice tense. Mark nodded, though his mind was far from the words they would exchange. He had rehearsed this moment in his head over and over again, but now that he was standing in front of her, it felt unreal. The weight of what he was about to do bore down on him, suffocating him. Laura launched into her demands, telling him how she couldn't wait any longer, how she deserved more than just being the other woman. She told him she loved him, that she was willing to sacrifice everything for him, but she needed him to do the same. As she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion, and tears welled up in her eyes. She believed Mark was on the verge of leaving Emma, that tonight would be the night he finally committed to her. But as Laura's voice echoed in the still night, Mark felt a rising panic inside him. His world was falling apart, and the only way to stop it was to silence her. The rage and fear he had been suppressing for weeks exploded inside him, and before he realized what he was doing, he lunged at her. The attack was swift and brutal. Laura barely had time to register what was happening before Mark's hands were around her throat. She gasped for air, her eyes wide with shock and terror. She struggled, clawing at his arms, but Mark's grip tightened, fueled by a combination of fear, anger, and desperation. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to ending the nightmare. The struggle lasted only moments, but to Mark, it felt like an eternity. When Laura finally went limp in his arms, he staggered back, horrified by what he had done. Her lifeless body crumpled to the ground, her face pale in the moonlight. Mark stood frozen, his breath ragged and uneven, staring down at her in disbelief. He had killed her. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had turned his life upside down, was gone. For a few moments, Mark stood in stunned silence, his mind unable to process the reality of the situation. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. His heart pounded in his chest, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins made his hands shake. But the shock didn't last long. Mark knew he had to act quickly. The evidence of his crime was right in front of him, and if he didn't cover his tracks, it wouldn't be long before the police came knocking. He bent down and checked Laura's pockets, making sure there was nothing that could connect her to him. Then, with shaking hands, he dragged her body deeper into the woods, trying to find a place where she wouldn't be discovered. Every movement felt mechanical, as if he were outside of his own body, watching himself from a distance. He buried Laura's phone and anything else that could trace her back to him. Once he was certain there was nothing left behind, he walked back to his car, his mind racing with how to explain his absence if anyone asked. When Mark finally returned home that night, Emma was already asleep. He slipped into bed beside her, his mind still reeling from what he had done. But as he lay there in the darkness, he told himself that it was over. Laura was gone, and his secret was safe. He would never have to worry about the affair again. But the nightmare was far from over. Laura King's disappearance didn't go unnoticed for long. When she failed to show up for work the next day and didn't answer calls or messages, her friends became concerned. They knew she had been seeing someone, though she had never revealed who it was, and they began to piece together the timeline of her last known whereabouts. At first, the police treated Laura's disappearance as a missing persons case. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, and they suspected she might have gone away on her own. But as days passed with no word from Laura, the investigation intensified. Her friends and family insisted that she would never just disappear without telling anyone, and the detectives assigned to the case began to dig deeper into her life. It didn't take long for them to discover the affair. Laura's close friends knew she had been involved with a married man, though she had been careful to keep his identity hidden. But the detectives were thorough, and soon enough, they uncovered the connection between Laura and Mark Donovan. Mark had tried to keep their affair a secret, but he hadn't been as careful as he thought. Phone records, emails, and text messages painted a damning picture of their relationship, and Mark quickly became the prime suspect in Laura's disappearance. The police questioned Mark, and at first he stuck to his story. He claimed he hadn't seen Laura in days, that he didn't know where she had gone. He presented himself as concerned but distant, trying to downplay the seriousness of their relationship. He thought he had covered his tracks well enough, but the detectives weren't convinced. They began to scrutinize his every move, searching for inconsistencies in his story. Meanwhile, Emma was left in the dark, struggling to understand what was happening. She had no idea about the affair or the investigation, and Mark did everything he could to keep it that way. But as the pressure mounted, it became harder for him to maintain the facade. He grew increasingly paranoid, checking his phone constantly, afraid that the police were closing in on him. It wasn't long before the cracks in Mark's story began to show. Detectives noticed that his timeline didn't add up, and they found inconsistencies in his alibi. They also discovered that he had been in contact with Laura shortly before her disappearance, a fact he had conveniently left out during his initial interview. The more they dug, the more suspicious Mark's behavior became. Then came the breakthrough, the piece of evidence that would unravel everything. During a routine search of Mark's financial records, detectives discovered a transaction that led them to a secluded gas station near the area where Laura's car had been found. Security footage from the gas station showed Mark's car in the vicinity on the night Laura disappeared. It was the final piece of the puzzle. With this new evidence in hand, the detectives obtained a warrant to search Mark's home and car. What they found sealed his fate. Hidden in the trunk of his car was a small piece of fabric that matched the clothing Laura had been wearing on the night she vanished. It was the evidence they needed to arrest him. Mark was taken into custody, his calm demeanor shattered as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. The man who had once thought he could outsmart the police now found himself facing charges of murder, and the life he had worked so hard to protect was in ruins. As the case against Mark unfolded, the full story of his affair with Laura and the events leading up to her death were revealed to the public. The trial was a media sensation, with every detail of Mark's betrayal and Laura's tragic fate laid bare for the world to see. Emma, devastated by the revelations, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, while Mark faced the consequences of the choices he had made. The truth had come out, and Mark Donovan, once a respected husband and businessman, was now a convicted murderer. The trial of Mark Donovan was a media sensation. The details of the affair, the betrayal, and the murder captivated the public. In court, the prosecution laid out the case against Mark, painting him as a man driven by desperation to protect his secret. They presented the evidence, the affair, the threatening messages between Mark and Laura, and the discovery of Laura's body, all of which pointed to Mark's guilt. Mark's defense team tried to argue that the murder had been a crime of passion, a moment of weakness in which Mark had lost control. But the jury saw through the defense. The premeditated nature of the crime, the lengths Mark had gone to cover it up, and the cold, calculated way he had tried to hide his tracks all led to one conclusion: Mark Donovan was guilty of murder. The verdict was clear, and Mark was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Laura King. Emma, devastated by the betrayal and the loss of her best friend, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The affair had destroyed not only her marriage but also the trust she had placed in those closest to her. The story of Mark Donovan serves as a chilling reminder of how secrets, lies, and betrayal can spiral out of control. What began as an affair ended in a brutal murder, leaving a family broken and a community forever scarred by the tragedy.